So Mussolino and Lids in 2006 tried to figure out how kids were interpreting these scopally ambiguous utterances. And they had a variety of contexts with different results, so we'll walk through those. And so the first one is something like this. Oh, look, 3 kitties. They tried to jump on the table, but couldn't. It was too tall. So this is an early failure context because the first thing the participants in the experiment try to do, they don't succeed at, right? So early failure, kitties didn't make it onto the table. Then they tried to jump on a bed, and look, 2 of them made it, right? So now you have 2 of the participants succeeding and 1 not. So this kitty didn't make it onto the bed, these 2 kitties did. So then the kids were asked, is this an okay thing to say? Every kitty didn't jump on the bed, looking at this context right here. And so, in general, 4 and 5-year-olds really don't like to say yes that often. They're much more comfortable saying, this is not an okay description of this event, right? So given that early failure context, they see now 2 of your 3 kitties actually made it onto the bed, but they don't like saying every kitty didn't jump on the bed. So very low yes, very high no response to this. So your baseline preference is not to endorse this utterance. Okay. So that's an early failure context. So then they try manipulating the context a bit. So here's what they did. Oh, look, 3 kitties. They tried to jump on the table and they all made it, right? So this is an early success, right? The first thing they try to do, they succeed at. They are good jumpers, for example, right? Then they tried to jump on the bed and look, 2 of them made it, right? So you're like, okay, so 2 of your 3 kitties made it. So now what happens? Well, every kitty jumped on the table, but every kitty didn't jump on the bed. Is that an okay thing to say? And for kids, this definitely helped. Now your 4 and 5-year-olds are saying yes 60% of the time. And still no 40% of the time, but this is a huge improvement, right? So every kitty jumped on the table, but every kitty didn't jump on the bed. They're happier with that, right? They seem to be endorsing that inverse scope interpretation. So then a follow-up study with Vao et al. In 2010 also found that it's even that kind of behavior, that kind of endorsement, even if you don't say, oh, look, every kitty jumped on the table first. You just have to have the context, this early success context, where the kitties all made it onto the table. And then you just say, in this context, where only 2 out of the 3 made it onto the bed, every kitty didn't jump on the bed, and kids are still okay, about 60% of the time. It's an improvement. It's not adult levels, but it's better. So why does this increase children's endorsement rate? Why does having that early success context help? And the idea, which comes from a recent work by Savinelli, Scontris, and Pearl, is that what it's doing is changing children's expectation about the world of the experiment, right? So if you think kitties are really good at jumping, it's informative to mention that not all of them succeeded at jumping on the bed, right? You thought they were going to, but they didn't. That's informative, right? So if kitties were bad at jumping, early failure kind of kitties, it's not really informative to mention that not all of them succeeded at jumping on the bed because you wouldn't expect them to. They're really bad at jumping. So like saying not all is like, well, sure, but I didn't expect any of them to anyway. So that's a weird thing to say in an early failure context is the takeaway. And another idea about this early success context, it's actually also changing children's expectations about the implicit topic of conversation known as the question under discussion, or QUD for short, right? And so the idea is like, okay, if kitties are really good at jumping, then the conversation, what you're talking about really, since they're all so very good at jumping, is whether all of them succeeded. And that makes the interpretation that not all of them succeeded very informative, right? In contrast, if kitties were bad at jumping, early failure, then the conversation is more likely to be about whether none of them succeeded, whether they all failed again, which makes the interpretation that not all of them succeeded kind of weird and not informative. Third idea from Vao et al. 2010 is that the problem is more about children's access to the inverse scope interpretation, that not all reading, because the inverse scope interpretation is actually harder to grammatically drive. You have to invert the order of those little scopal operators, and that takes some cognitive work. It's harder. So maybe the problem is simply that kids have trouble accessing it no matter what else is going on, right? And this is a little video that talks about that. But to kind of look at that in more detail, what they did is that they had 3 trials of early success, and they had about 50% endorsement on that. And then they had 3 trials with early failure afterwards, right? So they've taken away the helpful, supportive, pragmatic context in these trials. And now kids have 80% endorsement, right? So the idea was like, oh, well, they got kind of used to, or practice in some sense, and getting that inverse scope reading. So then when they were given 3 more trials, they were good at getting it, good at deriving it. It was sort of easier to access. Right? So maybe they could more easily access that not all interpretation based on their practice, so to speak, with the 3 trials that had the supportive context. Another explanation, though, is that early success, again, changes children's expectations about the experimental world or about the question under discussion, which makes the inverse interpretation more informative. So you could be primed to get that one, not because it's just easier to grammatically get, but rather because it's the one that seems to be the more informative answer previously, so maybe it's the more informative and sensible answer this time too. So we did one more experimental manipulation, which was they had an early failure context, so a not supportive context, and then they had an unambiguous utterance. So 3 trials of not every kitty jumped on the bed, right? Why is that unambiguous? Because in English, you actually can't get the other reading. In this case, you cannot swap the order of these quantifiers. You have to interpret this as not every, right? Great. So that's unambiguous. That interpretation of not all is what you have to get. So you have the unsupportive context, but the utterance just leads you into the not all interpretation. And then, okay, if we give you that 3 times, and you're pretty good at getting the not all interpretation, then we give you the ambiguous one. And guess what? You still are now getting, or at least endorsing, that not all interpretation, right? So one explanation, again, children can more easily access that inverse, that not all interpretation after having somewhat had practice with it for the first 3 trials. But again, another explanation, the unambiguous utterance, what it does, not every kitty, it changes children's expectations about the world. You have now you have specific ideas really about how good kitties are at jumping, right? Or what the conversation tends to be about in this experimental world, which again makes the inverse interpretation more informative. So the main takeaway from this is really hard to tell from these experiments, as lovely and interesting as they are about manipulating all these factors. Is children's endorsement behavior due to the grammatical factors like the ability to access the inverse scope? Maybe. Or due to pragmatic factors like expectations about the world or the question under discussion that change the informativity of that interpretation. And that is really hard to do experimentally only.